So, just what is individual relationship counseling or coaching? IRC for short. It is simply the same kind of information being shared with two people in a couple, but just not at the same time, not seeing them in session together, which would be conjoint counseling. So you've got individual, just one person, conjoint, both people together, or in the case of a family, more than two. So the first question that most people really want the answer to is, why would you do relationship counseling with individuals separately and not as a couple? And the answer is actually quite simple. DPA, diffuse physiological arousal, also known as flooding, a term that was coined, I believe, by John Gottman. The technical term, or the technical idea, is the activation of the sympathetic nervous system, which is also known as the body going into fight or flight. Now, DPA, diffuse physiological arousal, is aptly named because diffuse means that it spreads widely throughout the system. And that's what happens with DPA. These chemicals and changes spread fiercely, quickly, wildly around the system. Now, physiological, the P should be pretty self-evident, right? Physiological and arousal, yeah. Where physiologically, the physical body is aroused. Now, physiological arousal is characterized by two major chemicals, adrenaline and cortisol. And when the system is flooded with those, a lot of things happen. Now, adrenaline is speed, essentially. I mean, it is like rocket fuel for the body, makes the body 2 to 3 times stronger and faster to get out of danger if needed. And cortisol is the other chemical that is, it's a steroid, and it helps the body deal with inflammation in case of injury, things like that. So once those two chemicals blast into the body, and they do blast into the body, they move into the body immediately, very quickly. Heart rate increases dramatically, as does respiration or breathing rate. And, things we might not be aware of. I mean, most people know that when they get nervous and anxious or scared, fearful, their heart's beating real fast and they're, short of breath, breathing very fastly. But what a lot of people don't know is that the blood in our system is actually shunted from our extremities to the core, the heart, the lungs, and the brain. In fact, when I used to do some seminar work with stress and anxiety, we had things called bio dots, and they were simply the old mood ring thermal color change dots, and you'd place them right in your hand. And what they did is they simply measured temperature, and they turned colors based on temperature. And when people were stressed, which we could demonstrate easily just by pinching someone or just by having someone tell a stressful story, their dot would go black. And then when they calmed back down, it would become a pretty blue. And the reason for that is because as the hand got warmer, the color got more toward the blue spectrum. It would go greenish and then all the way to blue. And then when stress happened, when the blood left and it cooled down, it turned to black. And the reason for that is that we need all that blood in an emergency situation around the heart and the lungs and the brain for nourishment and cushioning and all of that. Now, another thing that happens in DPA is that all systems that are unnecessary for survival are temporarily suspended. Now, by that I mean things like digestion. I think digestion is a really good example of that. It just shuts down during DPA. You don't need it. Now, how do we experience that? Well, for a lot of people, that's the butterflies in the stomach, right? I'm before a speech, I just can't eat anything. That's digestion shutting down. And sometimes we feel that shortness of breath, maybe a dizziness, dry mouth, nausea, and very, very anxious. And these are all attempts by the human body to survive a catastrophe. We're talking about life or death situations. Adrenaline provides the speed and the strength to flee or to fight, depending on what you choose. It again, the adrenaline is the rocket fuel. It makes people 2 to 3 times stronger or faster. And cortisol, the steroid, prepares the body for injury. It increases blood sugars, glucose, and it enhances that use of that glucose and increases the availability of it in the event that we're injured, right? Those substances that repair growth and repair tissues. Now, along with that, cortisol does a lot of other things. It curbs functions that would normally be essential, but are non-essential when we're in a fight or flight situation. So there's a lot happening in DPA. Now, some of it's very obvious, right? The increased heart rate and breathing provide that extra oxygen to the bloodstream. And of course, as I told you before, the blood shunted to the core vital organs. That makes sense, right? And suspending activity of things like digestion, anything that we don't need, mobilizes our body for battle, for fight or flight. But there's one very important thing that many people don't realize is happening as well. Diffuse physiological arousal literally shuts down the prefrontal cortex. Now, this is the area of the brain used to solve problems and make decisions. And instead, that activity is, instead of going to the prefrontal cortex, which that corridor pretty much shuts down, it goes to the limbic system, what we call the limbic system. And the chief player in the limbic system is the amygdala. That's kind of the control center for get out of danger. That is our get out of danger, avoiding danger, seeking pleasure powerhouse, right? Or control center. Now, at first blush, that might seem to folks like kind of a design flaw, right? When we need it most, if one would think, right? Common sense would tell us when we need it most, the prefrontal cortex shuts down. Why would that happen? But in retrospect, it's actually a quite elegant and genius design. When the human system is in DPA, the assumption is I'm in trouble, right? The only thing that's necessary then is whether to fight or flee. And that decision gets taken out of the prefrontal cortex and gets made by the amygdala. And the system itself is turned into what we call an attentional system, which means it's only paying attention to cues of danger. Now, the prefrontal cortex is simply not necessary and only has the potential to interfere. Yeah, we don't want to stop and waste any time thinking about it. So, putting it quite plainly, if one stops to think, it might be too late. So, the thought of that kind, our decision making, pondering, reflecting, that's all temporarily eliminated. Fight or flee first. And if you happen to survive that, there will be time to think about it and reflect later. Now, what is super surprising to most people is that in conjoint sessions, couples, counseling, DPA occurs most of the time. Gottman discovered this in his research. And because he was able to do that, let me restate that. He was able to do that because he had subjects wearing heart monitors. And that gave him heart rate information and respiration rate information in real time while they were watching the videos or watching the couples from behind two-way mirrors. So what he found was that most couples that were ultimately going to divorce or ultimately, going down that unhealthy road. In fact, all couples in that category zoomed into DPA the minute that problems were discussed. In fact, many of them, when they were together, hardly ever got out of DPA. Imagine that. Now, DPA is normally defined as having a heart rate that exceeds about 100 beats per minute when that particular human being is not exercising. Now, when you think about it, that kind of makes sense, doesn't it? I know it actually really makes sense. In couples that are at war or in disagreement, DPA is going to be easy to slip into, and many folks have no idea how to get out of it. Now, interestingly enough, in couples that remained healthy for the duration, which is, a decade or two out, DPA was rarely observed. And when it did happen, the couples had the common sense to take a break and pick up the conversation later. It's as if they knew without being told exactly when they were crossing that DPA threshold. And then they would both voluntarily suspend the conversation until they were calmer, right? They both had that capacity. Sometimes it was one person saying, hey, I've got to stop this conversation now. Now, as a side note here, that conversation wasn't tabled or swept under the rug. When they said they were going to get back to it, they got back to it every single time.